And good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today on the webinar. My name is Nuala Zietsma, and I'm the Director of Strategy and Engagement for OPG's Nuclear Sustainability Services, and also the Director for the Centre of Canadian Nuclear Sustainability, the CCNS, located in Pickering. The CCNS is a place for industry, community, students, academia to listen and learn from each other and to collaborate and share ideas. So with that, today we are very pleased to have the IESO with us to provide an in-depth look at their recently released Pathways to Decarbonization report. So I personally feel really extremely lucky to live in Ontario, where our electricity system is already more than 90% emissions free. However, as we know, with the growing demand for electricity, we have a tremendous feat ahead of us to both ensure that we'll be ready for those needs and demand, but also meet our goals of a net zero economy by 2050. So I won't give away any of the data in the presentation. I'll leave that for the IESO. But one clear takeaway is that it will take all of us working together as a team, because the magnitude of what we need means we need all hands on deck, working collaboratively. I would like to introduce our chair, Matthew Meiringer. Matthew is my colleague in OPG's Nuclear Sustainability Division and a big advocate for a net zero economy. Matthew is a nuclear engineer and a member of the Energy Council of Canada and a board member of the CNA. Matthew Meiringer is also North American Young Generation and NUIGM president, and in June he'll be the first ever Canadian president. So Matthew, take it away.
I just want to make sure, are we live?
Is it alive or? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Nuala Zietsma, and I'm the Director of
Nuala, you're on mute.
Okay, I'm going to start here. So I will start with the land acknowledgement. So Ontario Power Generation specifically acknowledges that the lands on which the Centre for Canadian Nuclear Sustainability is situated, and many of the OPG sites, are located on the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations. We also acknowledge that Durham Region and the surrounding area is home to Indigenous peoples from across the territory and country. OPG also respectfully acknowledges that Indigenous peoples are the original stewards and caretakers of the land, and that they continue to maintain this responsibility to ensure its health and integrity for generations to come, and we remain committed to developing positive and mutually beneficial relationships with Indigenous communities across Ontario. I now have the privilege of introducing our next speaker. So Salvatore Providenza, I've been working on that one, rolling my R's for him, holds a mechanical engineering degree from U of T and an MBA from Rotmans. He worked for Ontario Power Authority and independent electricity operator for 12 years in both power systems planning and contract management. In his current role as manager, reporting and economic analysis, he oversees a team responsible for many modeling assumptions and the synthesis of results, including which the report we're going to talk about today, the Pathways to Decarbonization. If you do have questions throughout this presentation, you can put them in the chat, the Q&A there, and at the end we'll take up those questions and answer them. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Salvatore.
Thank you for the introduction, Matthew. The rolling of the R's was spot on point. First, I want to thank the CCNS for inviting the IESO to speak today. It's been quite the journey producing this report on, as Nuala said, a very important topic. It's a challenge that we need to understand together. We need to collaborate in order to reach our goals. And that includes starting off with presentations like this to our stakeholders, industry organizations, and individuals. So thank you for that. I'm joined by, for the question period, James Yu, a senior planner, our load forecasting group, as well as Julia McNally, Director of Planning Projects and Sustainability. She's the one that kept us on track and helped lead to the successful publication of the report. All of the really hard questions go to them. I'll probably speak for around 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the Q&A period. Slide. Agenda. So I'll set the context a little bit, talk a bit about Ontario, and then we'll dive into the report, and then lastly, we'll get to the important insights. Slide. So with any good presentation, start off with the so what. This is what we want to drive home throughout the course of the presentation and get to. So obviously, demand for electricity is on the rise. This is both driven by natural growth as well as electrification. Decarbonization is a high priority for many customers, not just individuals, but companies as well. You'll see a lot of companies making public statements about environmental and social corporate governance. So it's very important. Absent electrification, we're also entering a bit of a challenging period too, with just the exiting of resources that have been on our system for a while. We've got Pickering nuclear plant set to close 2025, 2026. We have an aging natural gas fleet. One of our largest gas facilities, Lennox, has been around for quite a long time, and with pending electricity regulations coming about that talk about plant age, not just Lennox, but a number of other facilities may be limited in the lifetime they have left to serve the system. We'll also be acquiring a ton of new resources to meet growth, to meet electrification. We need those resources. We need the right supply mix, the right resource mix to take care of all of our system needs, capacity, energy, operability, and so on. Like I said, all this is going to take careful planning and collaboration and coordination. And while we're doing this, we have to keep a few things in mind. One, we need to maintain a reliable system. And two, it needs to be affordable going forward. Slide. Okay, Ontario today. So right now, Ontario, electrically, we have a peak demand of roughly 23,000 megawatts. In terms of total consumption throughout the year, it's approximately 134 terawatt hours. We have a pretty diverse resource fleet already. We've been relying on nuclear and hydro as the backbone for baseload production. We'll continue to do so in the future. But we also have a number of other fuels and resources in our mix, including wind, solar, and natural gas. Natural gas is the resource we rely on mostly for balancing, dealing with those minute-to-minute, hour-to-hour changes in demand, or if things happen on the system that are unexpected, it's one of the resources we go to help keep us balanced. Slide. Let's talk about Ontario a bit generally. We live in a very big province, 1 million kilometers squared, and we have a very large population, substantial percentage of the Canadian population. Although most of our population is in southern Ontario, bordering with other jurisdictions, we do have low pockets throughout the province, and all these pockets need to be served. Need to maintain affordability, and so in the same vein, it'll be a challenge to get non-emitting electricity everywhere, so something to keep in mind. We don't operate in isolations. We're electrically interconnected with a number of different jurisdictions. This creates system efficiencies and cost reductions, as well as there are reliability benefits as well. As Nuala mentioned in her introduction, we're already a very clean electricity system, 90% clean, one of the cleanest in North America. And we're also the first major jurisdiction that once upon a time relied on coal to get off coal. And that happened around 2014 or so. It was something that was carefully planned. It took 10 to 12 years. Pre-development, pre-thought, and actually making our way through. But at the time, we did benefit from natural gas waiting in the wings, similar type fuel with similar type characteristics. Right now, we don't have that going forward. So that presents an extra challenge for us, and we have to make sure we procure the right resource mix to get the job done. Slide. To our Pathways to Decarbonization report. The impetus for this is actually, I would say, started early 2021. At the time, as I was saying before, environmental, social, corporate governance ramping up, not just for corporations, but also for municipalities. There were a number of municipalities that passed resolutions about clean energy. And so at that point in time, there were also a lot of other studies coming out, more nationally based, on how to decarbonize the economy through electrification. So the IESO thought it prudent to join the conversation, especially with our unique perspective. You'll see a lot of studies that focus on top line capacity and energy, but we need to be able to operate the grid, and that includes important considerations. That's within our purview. So we joined the conversation. We published a study about whether or not we could get off gas by 2030 was the original off gas study. The conclusion there was we didn't have enough time. And in addition to not having enough time, to do it by then would be quite costly. So following the publication of that report, the Ministry of Energy issued us a directive asking two questions. One, to evaluate a moratorium on natural gas procurement, and another one to develop a pathway to zero emissions in the electricity sector. Slide. So with any scenario, and I like to emphasize scenario, as what the IESO produced, although we relied upon a lot of the tools and metrics that we do for power system planning, namely our APOs, what we've produced really are scenarios to just show the scale of the effort required to meet both challenges, moratorium and pathways. To go forward, we would need typical power system plan with recommendations, rigorous analysis, and so that's something on the agenda to go forward if directed to do so. Starting with demand, the moratorium scenario and a lot of our supply assumptions are grounded in the 2021 APO. We did add or net from the demand profile, increased achievable potential for energy efficiency. The cheapest megawatt or megawatt hour to add to the system is usually the one you don't have to produce. So we really looked at conservation as the first resource to meet these challenges. The load forecast for the pathways scenario looked at aggressive policy-driven electrification, and we focused on some of the bigger sectors like transportation, especially with the adoption of EVs, heating, moving over from natural gas to what we hope would be efficient electrification, and the move towards heat pumps, as well as the electrification of the industrial processes. An example there is in recent announcements in the north with mining, moving from traditional furnaces to electric arc furnaces. So, slide. So after producing the demand profile of what we need to meet in the future, we relied on a process and the development of new tools, namely a capacity expansion model, which takes in all the intelligence about demand and the suite of available resources, including our cost and performance information. We took that and was able to produce a view on what a supply mix or resource mix should be. And then we applied some of our more rigorous standards and processes to that to make sure that what it provided was capacity and energy adequate past everything we need for transmission security, as well as an operability screening. And what we determined for the moratorium was that post 2027, it is possible to go forward and achieve an electricity system that's lower emitting by 2035 without further incremental natural gas procurements. Like I said, following 2027, in October of this year, we did produce a report on the interim report on eligibility of resources. We have some long-term procurements coming up about 4,000 megawatts of supply, and within that, up to 1,500 megawatts of natural gas may be procured. And so this is what we got to. So you'll see on the left, there's today's capacity remaining in 2035. That's the stuff we have now, for the most part made up of nuclear, hydro, or existing wind and solar. A lot of that stuff will still be available in 2035. Like I said, we developed a capacity expansion model that took into account all of the intelligence based on demand requirements. Natural gas was allowed to compete in that process, and we did retain a fair amount of natural gas. 2027, roughly 12,000 megawatts of natural gas. By 2035, we've dropped that down to 8,000. 5,000 of that is what came out of the competition within the model. Some of that was required for certain areas where transmission wouldn't be able to be developed in time. To remove those plants from service. And then based on the operability screen, our experts there thought it prudent to maintain another 3,000 megawatts for operability and reliability. So what the capacity expansion model picked out, in addition to maintaining some of that gas, was more nuclear, around 1,000 megawatts, as well as some wind and solar. We found that the result of that would enable us to decrease emissions in 2035 by 8 megatons, so about a 60% decrease in emissions. We did find that in order to both build this new supply and enable the mix through transmission would require $26 billion in capital over that time period. And we'd end up in a system that would have an annual total system cost of around 26 million. 24 billion, up about 2 billion from the current cost. And so with that, you're able to calculate and apply cost of carbon there, and it's around $240 per ton of CO2 equivalent. Go to the next slide. So getting to 2050, a fully decarbonized economy, much grander in scale. Saw the addition to a total of around 90,000 megawatts of total resources. Again, like I mentioned before, conservation will play a key role, and that's already been accounted for in the demand forecast. To get here, we need everything is on call. We need everything every year. Part of that intelligence that was built into the model was a limit on how much we could build by resource type every year. We want to keep this in reality, knowing that we have limited resources to build these things. And when I say resources, talking about workforce, capital, etc. And so, like I said, we end up with a system that's around 90,000 megawatts in size. I quoted some numbers from moratorium. I'll quote some similar ones here. Total capital spent on building these supply resources, as well as the enabling transmission, in the 400 billion range. And I mentioned before that total annual system costs was around 26 billion for the moratorium, 24 billion for the moratorium. Here we would see total system costs in the area of 70 billion per year. Keeping in mind though, that's spread over a lot more electricity. So when you think of things like the unit cost of electricity, so total cost divided by the amount of energy actually produced, we actually see an increase of around 30%. Another thing to keep in mind here is we're electrifying. There will be savings for individuals and companies in terms of what they're moving away from, in terms of the service provided by electricity. So now you're charging your electric vehicle, but at the same time, you're not paying for the gasoline that you would have paid otherwise, right? Move to the next slide. As I said, transmission and interties play a big role. We're essentially doubling up our transmission system, the 500 kV backbone, as well as a number of 230 kV corridors. We also identify that there are opportunities for firm import agreements with some of our jurisdictions. In the spirit of this report and the objective we're trying to get to, the capacity expansion model, we open that up just to Quebec, knowing that they do have a complete emissions-free system over there. They benefit, and they've benefited from a lot of hydro potential, a lot of storage, including seasonal. They are rubbing up against their own capacity requirements. So we assume that anything that, in terms of an import agreement and what they would need to build, they would be building for us. Go to the next slide. Usually when you put together one of these reports, you have like a favorite graphic. This was my favorite graphic coming out of the report. I've already quoted some of these, but this is by the numbers again for our pathways scenario. In addition to cost, we also did some calculations for some other consumables. So I'm just trying to get the framing there so people can really understand how big of a challenge we were facing, how big of an initiative. In terms of land use, so when we were running our tools, we were indiscriminate about location, but recognizing that there are some resources that you can only build in certain places. Hydro is an example, nuclear is another. You want to pick the best sites for wind and solar. Looking at the total build and the total requirements, we're looking at siting for resources on the order of 14 times the size of Toronto. Another important feature or outcome or part of the province is collaboration. So industry partners in this includes participation from our first Métis and First Nations peoples. In terms of capital and labor, we're looking at a 6-fold increase over the amount today that we're working on in terms of electricity sector development. We recommend a focus on innovation. One of the resources that we permitted for the pathways scenario post 2035 was a low carbon fuel, and it got picked up in spades almost every year to its annual build limit, so 1,000 megawatts a year. This is a big question mark, but something we'll need to figure out. The system would benefit from having a resource of this type, of that flexible nature on the system. Whether or not that comes to fruition, we don't know. So we'll need backup plans, and we'll need to think about how we're able to meet these same challenges absent a technology like this. Another thing we need to do is increase policy certainty, both to drive investment as well as reduce lead times for constructing some of these longer development type resources. And that extends the regulatory process as well. We want to streamline things as much as possible. We want to be able to be nimble and react to what we see in terms of electrification and our growing demand. And taking some of these actions will help with that. Slide. Addressing risks. So I've been touching on it throughout the above, but we'll itemize it here on the slide again. So long lead time type resources, so hydro, nuclear, transmission, things that take upwards of 10 years, 10 to 15 years to development. We need to trim that up. And like I said, keep things nimble and be able to react. Will require significant investments. So we'll need to make sure the capital is there, the materials, the labor, keeping in mind that the entire world is trying to do this at the same time. So there is going to be competition for all of these things. So we need to get started. Again, meaningful and transparent discussions with our communities, including First Nations and Indigenous communities. So let's get started on the stakeholdering and make sure that we're all in agreement on where we can put these things and that there's a real partnership there. Again, cost management important. I highlighted this before, reliability and affordability. And any of those new resources that are coming to be toeing on the horizon, if we can advance them further, the more we have available to us, the easier it will be. Slide. So I highlighted my favorite figure graphic. Within these reports, sometimes you also have a favorite kind of catchphrase. My favorite, the no regrets actions. So these are the things more on the opportunity side of the challenges when you convert. So things we think we need to push forward with and have no regrets. And that starts off with, let's start building that non-emitting supply now. Even under the moratorium type scenario, without aggressive electrification, we need to build these things as soon as possible. So I talked about the wind, the solar, and eventually nuclear, which has a bit longer lead time than those resources. And again, it needs to be. This is something that we need to manage and get started on now to make sure it's available there for the future. Again, on the siting, resources that can only go in certain places and have lengthy permitting and approvals timelines. Those are things we need to get started on now. Replacing natural gas, it's something that we can't do with a single resource. We rely on natural gas for a lot of things, spanning capacity, energy, and operability. So we really need to work on the next best alternatives and push those forward. And if we can't, we have to figure out how to do and meet all those services with what is available. I think I covered off the rest of these a number of times. So we can go to the next slide. Adaptation and resilience. So one thing that was not included or contemplated within our study is changing in weather patterns and what that is going to do. And as you can see from the figure here, in terms of volatility there, you can see it both increasing temperature as well as the volatility there as well. So that's something that we need to understand going forward and include in our planning process. Slide. Integration and adaptation to planning and procurement. Probably covered a number of these off already. But again, we need to understand how the system is changing, the impact of climate on heating and cooling. Demand shape is important, right? Often people show like duration curves, which is an ordering. That gives you a sense of how many peaking resources you need, how many baseload resources you need. But in terms of day-to-day, minute-to-minute operability, you need to understand that load shape and have the resources in place to be able to match supply with demand second to second. Some of these studies are underway. The slide here notes EPRI's Climate Ready program. There's also RFP and development within the IESO to review our processes and try and understand this climate challenge. Slide. I believe this is my final slide, so the key inside slide. We need to act now. I've been pushing this forward throughout the presentation. I'll say it again. Electrification is going to move at an unprecedented pace. We need to monitor those kind of goalposts in the future to make sure that we react appropriately. And we might as well get started now. Spend that upfront time, spend that upfront capital, and have that option value there ready for us. Replacing the reliability services by gas is a complex task. We need to understand the options, whether or not that's development of low carbon fuels that can be used in similar facilities to what natural gas uses and provide the same level of services. We need to push those forward. And if we can, if there's a challenge there, we need to understand that what we can do in the absence of that particular resource type. Challenges need to be addressed, and again, everybody's doing this at the same time, right? Access to capital, labor, materials, streamline the regulatory processes to get these resources in place. And then there's the subject of cost allocation. Is there going to be further subsidization of electricity system costs by the taxpayers? How are we going to allocate costs among the different sectors, residential, commercial, industrial? All important questions that we need to figure out. Understand the impact of weather. We covered that. And then, of course, one of the most important ones, which is the coordination and collaboration across the sector, across the province. This is going to be a team effort, and we can't do it alone. We need all of the minds, all hands on deck. But I'm confident that we'll be able to do this. So at this time, I will stop presenting, and we can move over to the Q&A.
Okay, thank you. And we had a flurry of questions come in, so keep putting those in, and we will answer those as you submit those. I did want to also thank for making this possible the CCNS. We have ambassadors, we have catalysts, we have community partners So if you're not sure what the Canadian Centre for Nuclear Sustainability is, you can find out more on the website. And we will also be bringing you more webinars coming up, and I will put that in the chat. So we have one in February about tritium and the future of fusion. We have one about nuclear fusion, and that's both North America and UK perspectives. And we also have some SMR developments, again, from North America and UK perspectives. So you get more of a holistic view across the world. So again, I'll be putting those into the chats. But yeah, I want to start off now with some of the questions that we have here. So I'll just go in order when they are submitted. So the first one was, are there any interesting or surprising second or third order consequences of the electrification of transportation? For example, will the additional overnight load of EV charging, will it flatten the demand cycle and make initiatives like pump storage uneconomical?
So we did do some load shape analysis, and it is included in the report. What we found that in terms of summer peak it was pretty close to the same, maybe a bit flatter. Some important points worth noting that I didn't cover in the presentation is that we are going to be switching to a winter peaking system. In the moratorium type scenario, the APO type scenario, this happens in the 2030s. In the pathways scenario, this actually happens fairly quickly in the 2020s. And there's also an important distinction between the levels of peak when we get to 2050. And so the winter, it's upwards of 60,000 megawatts peak demand. In the summer, it's in the mid 30s. So when you think about the differential and the potential for building certain types of resources, and actually the consequences of maybe even having surplus, right? Anything you build over 30,000 or the mid 30s, that's a baseload type resource is going to result in surplus energy. The types of resources that we have in terms of storage, 4-hour batteries, longer durations, around 10 hours for pump storage, they can help a little bit, but they can't shift seasonally. But in terms of the load shape for the winter time, to answer your question more directly about EV charging and stuff, that is when we see kind of the peak of the day is in those morning hours where EVs are still charging, people are waking up, they're turning on the heat as they get out of bed, and the load profile moves to one where we see actually a number of peaks throughout the day with quite a bit of ramp required. So I would say storage would definitely be able to help out with that for those smoothing out those winter peaks in 2050. James, anything you want to add to that one as our load forecaster?
I think you summed it up pretty well. As Sal said, in the winter period, due to electrified building heating, the system does become winter peaking, and most of the building heating load happens in the after business hours period. And that's coincident with when we forecast the majority of electric vehicles to be charged at the same time. So kind of a double whammy in terms of the winter, but in terms of the summer, there is a little more flatness to the daily profile due to the charging in the after business hours period.
Now I'll go over to the next question now, which was all about how are we going to deal with the demand without natural gas generators? So how, if we take away that major source of carbon, how are we going to deal with the demand, and does it have any impact on the reliability of the grid? So we've taken it for granted kind of now that the Ontario grid is very stable, but what impact would that have?
This is the question we're trying to answer. A lot of our resources that provide what provides operability is a lot of it is natural gas. We do have a bit of flexible hydro as well as some bio that can wrap up quickly and do a few of the things that natural gas does. But the resource potential there isn't the same, like for like, to match with natural gas. Like I said, under the moratorium scenario for 2035, our operability screening, they focus on flexibility. So being able to shift quickly, durability, being able to meet sustained type events. Because we have cold snaps and we have heat waves that last longer than the duration of storage and don't necessarily give you the opportunity to recharge in time for the next day. These can be quite long. And then the last pillar there of operability is diversity. And that's essentially saying, you know what, we need balanced resource characteristics. Both come with good and with bad, I would say. And so you don't want to, you want to mitigate your risk by spreading things out, not unlike a financial portfolio. And to take something like natural gas away that does provide a lot of those things without having what I would say a well understood or confident replacement. We are adding storage to the grid, but we are going to continue to maintain natural gas there for a little bit too, because we need to understand how these resources actually act and work in the market at scale. We have a bit of storage in the system now, but we don't have 2,500 megawatts. And we're not asking it to do what natural gas does right now. So that's part of the plan. It's something that we did with the off coal challenge, where you leave the resource you're replacing on for a little bit, make sure there's some overlap, and so you can understand how things are going to operate in a system that doesn't have it in anymore. And if it is the case that we do need to keep gas on for a while, will we wait for another technology or will we procure other resources? We're going to do it. Like I said before, we need to maintain a reliable system during this energy transition. And what a transition implies is that there will be an overlap period. So, but no, that's a good question, and that's the crux of what we're trying to figure out here, and what we'll look to the sector to figure out with us together.
Thanks. And the next one's all about what's the expected increase in cost of power when phasing out the carbon emitting generators? And in the model, is there any assumptions on the carbon taxes and subsidies? I know this changes with governments. So just curious, especially since your team was dealing with the assumptions for this question.
So carbon's built into there. It forms part of the variable cost of natural gas, so it's included in our energy dispatch. And the capacity expansion model does to a certain extent dispatch the system a little bit. Focuses more on the capacity side of things, but that's why we follow up with our other adequacy studies to make sure we're both capacity and energy adequate. But it's in there, and it's for moratorium. It's in line with what's been stated publicly in terms of the federal carbon price as well as the emissions benchmark. We do make some assumptions for the pathways case where the cost of carbon continues to climb throughout the forecast period, while at the same time we're ratcheting down that carbon performance benchmark down to zero. The benchmark takes into account relative emissions rates. So essentially it provides a bit of a subsidy, but as that gets ratcheted down, carbon producers are fully exposed to the carbon price. I think I answered the second half of the question. I might need a repeat on the first half.
Yeah, so it's just, is there an expected increase in the cost of power as we phase out these carbon emitting generators? And I'm not sure if this is towards the government or the consumer. So yeah.
Yeah, overall, under the moratorium case I mentioned before, our system typically year to year, total system costs. So we're talking about contract payments for generators. We're talking about dispatch costs in the market. We're talking about other rate regulated assets like distribution and transmission. Total system costs on an annual basis year to year is around $22 billion. For the moratorium scenario, we saw that the path that was derived would increase it by another $2 billion. Like I said before, but we do remove a lot of emissions, 60% reduction. In addition to the actual price of carbon, there's an applied cost there, right? You're increasing costs here, you're reducing emissions here. You divide one by the other, and we found that an applied cost of carbon around $240 per ton for the moratorium scenario. On the pathways scenario, those annual system costs, they increase upwards of $70 billion. But I mentioned the kind of the unit cost of electricity, right? So total cost divided, because costs are going up, but the amount of electricity you're producing is going up too, right? So unit cost gives you some of that perspective there. Current system is around the $180 per megawatt hour range. For the pathways scenario, the upper bound there was around $215. So you are seeing a 30% increase there in the unit cost of power. And what I said, keep in mind, keep in context the fact that, yeah, you're going to pay more for electricity, but there are costs that you're no longer going to incur, relate to, say, natural gas heating or putting gasoline in your cars. So it's got to remember the total picture when you're thinking about total cost, right?
No, that makes sense. And the next one is about the assumptions for the 1 gigawatt of new nuclear. Does that represent 1 gigawatt above the existing installed capacity, or is that 1 gigawatt of new minus if Pickering were to go down? So just kind of more details on that assumption for nuclear.
It's 1 megawatt of new nuclear. One thing we did do, I did mention that for the moratorium scenario, we grounded it in the 2021 APO. To keep things relevant, we did make adjustments to that portfolio. One of those adjustments included the 300 megawatt kind of trial SMR that OPG is developing to be in service, I think, before the targeting before the end of the decade. So that extra gigawatt of nuclear power, that is incremental. That's something else that's being built new.
And the next one, I'm not sure if your team can take, but how are fugitive natural gas emissions, which are leaks from the wellhead to the turbine, factored into the climate impact? So they're going on that the industry is usually inaccurately low and exposes us to risk, especially unburned methane is more dangerous to the climate. I'm not sure if your team has any details for that.
That's out of scope for us, but I hope Enbridge is thinking about it.
Okay, the next, I figured that as well. So the next
Sorry,
question
Matthew, I'll just leap in and say, we also didn't consider it around the blue hydrogen. So also out of scope, we didn't think about the leakage from hydrogen, their compounding greenhouse gas impact. So that was also out of scope, just in case that follow-up question pops up.
The next question, though, should be in focus for you guys. So did the model consider the province's growth? So, 1.5 million by 2030, and how those may be powered, as well as estimates for the population growth and locations over the next decade?
I can take that question. So this question is in reference to Bill 23. Did I see that in the question?
Nothing specific to Bill 23, but it's just the new growth targets for the province.
Okay. So as I understand it, the new growth the growth in new homes target was on the basis of Bill 23, the Builds New Homes Faster bill that was passed in November. The demand forecast in the pathway scenario was developed earlier in 2022. That forecast did account for the long-term growth in immigration that the federal government has targeted. So there is long-term growth in new residential homes. It did not consider the specific number of the 1.5 million homes by 2030 that this recent bill has just passed, but in subsequent demand forecasts, that will definitely be considered.
And the next one is about the assumptions and opportunities related to conservation. And I just want to make a plug here that this report is available on your website. Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you wanted to highlight any of the kind of key assumptions or opportunities related to conservation, I know it's a kind of a big question.
Sure. So in the pathways scenario, demand forecasted did include increased conservation program savings. The highest level that was identified at the time of the forecast being finalized, that was based on the IESO's 2019 Conservation and Demand Management Achievable Potential Study. In that study, there were 4 levels that were identified. The level that identified the maximum achievable conservation savings was included in the pathways demand scenario. The ISO was produced in CDM APS refresh in 2022, so slightly different levels in that latest report that was released on the same day. So those levels will be incorporated in subsequent demand forecasts or pathways demand forecasts as well.
Yeah, and the next one is about waste. So nuclear generators are required to fund the management of their waste. It's built in upfront at the cost of electricity. Is there any comparison being done on an adjusted cost of power to include the cost of carbon recapture, or for wind and solar turbines, their waste management when those assets reach end of life? Because I know for wind and solar, it's between 20 and 30 years that their lifespan is. So just wondering if that's been considered.
I would say not explicitly in this report. I do know that number of contracts for wind and solar, and even part of the permitting and approvals process is decommissioning of the facility and a restoration to pre-site conditions. So wind developers, solar developers, they would have included those kinds of costs into or consider those kinds of costs when they're seeking a PPA or a net revenue requirement.
Okay, and the next one is all about what % of wind capacity has historically been available during peak demand days, so the hottest days of the year. Does this impact the generation projection of including too much wind to meet the peak demand scenarios?
So the capacity expansion model considers both cost and performance information. So we feed the profiles in there. And that kind of helps with the resource build out. So there is a consideration there. To answer the question, and this is something that we publish with the APO on an annual basis, and I actually think it's part of our reliability outlooks as well, is performance on demand for both wind and solar. Obviously, with improvements and technology, efficiency of wind turbines, that's going to change, potentially increase from year to year, but it's highly contextual, right? When we look at performance, we look at performance both, yes, on an absolute basis, in which case you could see wind and their capacity contribution in below 30% at the time at peak. But there's diminishing returns to adding a certain amount of particular resources more and more. Solar is a good instance. The more you add it, the more it actually changes the peak, right? So you see those benefits, but then as you add more and more, and as the peak changes, right, the benefits or the capacity contribution changes, right? Because you're moving from full peak in the middle of the day to the benefit incremental solar provides is only on the tails. So it's something we study. It's something that was considered in the resource mix, and it's something we monitor going forward.
Now, in terms of energy storage, what are some of the technologies that are being pursued, and what are you looking at in terms of capacities and maybe duration for how long that could supply?
So for the purpose of this study, we modeled both battery storage and longer duration pump storage based on projects that were actually named and part of the directive for consideration. But the intent there, and it's noted in the report, is that those are just supposed to be proxies for storage technologies overall. We're keeping an eye on everything in terms of existing technologies and the potential for them. So something like compressed air, as well as the development of new types of storage technologies. But ultimately, like I said before, this is just a scenario based on a model, based on intelligence. When we go to procure for the services that we need, it's going to be a competitive procurement. I don't expect it to be a drastically different resource mix that comes out of that, but it will be transparent, it will be competitive, and all resources will have an opportunity to compete there.
Okay, the next one is about the electrification of heating homes, and it's going to require a significant amount of electricity, producing a large peak in the cold weeks of January. As it will ultimately impact the grid, is there a preferred method of replacing that natural gas in homes through the eyes of the IESO, whether it's heat pumps or electric baseboard heaters or different technologies? Yeah.
So I can take that. I wouldn't say that IESO has a preference. What was included in the pathways demand scenario was for anything that was switched from natural gas to electric, the equipment that would be installed would be heat pumps. That just takes advantage of the coefficient of performance. That's just increases the efficiency for electrical heating. I think in a range of approximately 2.5 times.
Okay, we'll have 2 more questions here, so I'm going to ask one. So the report states the siting requirements that are 14 times the size of Toronto. So what are the largest contributors to this size impact?
That is a good question, and its exact numbers are probably detailed in the report or one of the data tables, but I imagine it would be it'd probably be wind based on total. On a per megawatt basis, it might be solar, but those are definitely the largest, I would say. Nuclear gives you a lot of bang for your buck. Yeah, there was some hydro as well. That's kind of site specific, but again, I would expect it to be wind and solar. Noting also that although we didn't explicitly say where some things are cited, and we fully acknowledge that some of the resource mix could be met through distributed generation. When I think of DG, it's probably more solar than anything else. So definitely say wind and then potentially solar if it's not DG.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in and say I think it's also worth noting that although we wrote 4 times the size of Toronto, we meant the city of Toronto, and that still makes up an enormously tiny percentage of the land mass of Ontario. I did the math before Christmas. Don't quote me, but it's like it's in the single digits as a percentage of the land mass of Toronto. So, yeah, it's more land than we're using now, but Ontario is a really big place.
Okay, one last question here. I'm not sure if this is the best one, but it's the one I'm going to grab. So how do you see SBG as we move toward net zero?
I think it's going to be, like I said, and if it holds, the forecast of relative peak demands going out to 2050. You got a peak demand in the winter that's 60 gigawatts, and a summer peak demand that's 35 gigawatts. Any base load resources that you're adding beyond 35 are going to produce a lot of surplus. Even within the summer period, if you have 35 gigawatts of baseload type resources, you're still that's just peak in the summer, right? It's gonna the overnight periods are going to be much lower than that. How do we use it or address it? Maybe these are opportunities for some coordination earlier on with some of our other jurisdictions to try and minimize surplus when put together. Otherwise, there'll be curtailments. The best way to do that is that shutting down nukes for half the year, is that spilling water a lot in the summer or in the other seasons. We don't know, but that's part of the scope of operability and the IESO's mandate to deal with those conditions. So it's an important consideration, and we're going to study that.
Okay, thank you for that. Any final closing remark that you didn't get to express here, James, Julia, or Salve, that you wanted to leave the audience with in 30 seconds or so?
I'm going to hand that one over to Julia. I don't exactly remember what I said during the presentation. It's all a blur to me. It was fast and furious. I'm sure in her mind, Julia's like, well, forgot to mention that, and he missed that point over there. So I'm going to let Julia chime in and fix everything I did wrong, and leave us with some closing remarks.
Amazing. Sal, perfect job. Covered the report beautifully. I'm going to echo Sal's comments, which is the task of managing the climate risk will likely require doubling the installed capacity of our system, will likely require more nuclear. We don't have to make all of these decisions until later in the decade, but we do have to get going now on the preliminary work, the siting, the planning, the business development. Your organization can be a big help and advocate for this work. And as Sal said, we all have to work together on this. Addressing climate change is a team sport. We have to be creative. We have to be careful but hopeful. We have to see problems not as barriers, but as solutions to solve. I pick up on the natural gas. How are we going to get off of it? I don't know yet, but we got people to the moon. We've solved all sorts of big problems. We need to put our heads together to figure out how to solve it. And maybe it's nuclear plus an electrolyzer, using that SBG and giving us peak, fuel for peak in the winter. So thank you for this opportunity. We're pretty excited about this report. We think it really pushes forward the conversation in Ontario, and super keen that you guys are picking up on it, and look forward to way more conversation.
Okay, and with that, I just want to thank our speakers here, James, Julia, and Salve. Nuala, thank you for providing opening remarks. So hopefully everyone heard that. We saw the pre-live versus the live, so we weren't sure if everyone caught that. I did link the Pathways report in the chat there, and also just want to give one final mention that there are these upcoming webinars. I again did put that in the chat, so if you want to learn more, hear about future developments, those are in the chat. And again, thank you all so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.